if we sail a little bit high.
Psalm 24, 1 and 2 says, "The earth is the Lord's, and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it. For God has founded it on the seas and established it in the rivers." Please pray with me. Almighty God, as we continue our series on stewardship, I pray that you will speak clearly to us, that you will help us to understand and to make that switch of mentality between being owners and being stewards. Help us to understand, God, what you would have us to do and implement it in our lives. We pray all of this in your holy name. Amen. So last week we talked about stewardship in general, and we talked about that mental switch that we have to make from owners to stewards, right? And do you remember what a steward is? What's another name for steward? Manager. That's a good one. That's the one I used. Anything else? Okay, that's okay. Creative thinking, people. Stewards or managers of what is God's. And we talked about that word, mine. I heard it a lot this week. With Isaiah starting to crawl around more and get around and be mobile, Judah is beginning to understand that there are things that he wants and he doesn't want his brother to have. And he doesn't really get that everything in the house is really mine and Brett's. We bought it. It's ours. But he thinks it's his. Anyway, so I heard that word, mine, a lot this week. But we feel the same way, don't we? The things that we have, the people that we love, it's mine. Our stuff, our cars, our houses, we bought it, we paid for it, it's mine. And last week we talked about kind of getting rid of that myth of mine, because nothing is mine. Everything is God's. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. And God desires for us to manage well what is God's. In response to God's generosity, we are to be generous. So it's this shift in thinking from mine to God's, from owners to stewards. And that's what we're going to talk about kind of the next several weeks. Last week, this week, and 2 more weeks. Because by then we might get it, right? If we talk about it enough. In God we trust. Through this series, that is our prayer. As we talk about what we can give to God, our money, our time, our talents, our resources, do we really trust God? And that's the question we're asking. It's also the prayer that we have throughout this series. Do we really function with that phrase, in God we trust? Well, today we're going to talk about holistic stewardship. Well, we're going to start talking about holistic stewardship. The next 3 weeks we're going to talk about holistic stewardship. What in the world is holistic stewardship? What does holistic mean? What's the first part of that word, whole? What does whole mean? You know what that means. No? Complete. All. Full. Okay. Holistic means the whole, emphasizing the importance of the whole and the interdependence of its parts. Our responsibility as stewards is that we are to be good stewards of all things and not just our money. When you think about stewardship, when somebody says, I'm doing a stewardship series, your kind of immediate thought is, oh, they're going to talk about money, right? We are going to talk about money. We have talked about money. We're going to do it again. But that's not it. That's not the only thing that God has called us to be good stewards of. Holistic stewardship is making stewardship this three-dimensional, all-encompassing kind of idea. It's not just one part of our life, one section of our life. It's not that we can take out just our money and say, God, I'll be a good steward of the money, but I'm not going to be a good steward of this or this or this. When we think of stewardship holistically, we think of being good stewards of our relationships. The gospel. Have you ever thought of being a steward of the gospel, a manager of what God has given us with that? Our money, the environment, our possessions, our time, our talents, and many other aspects of our lives. It is the beginning, it is... Pardon me just a minute. Holistic stewardship is beginning to think about stewardship as including our whole lives. So holistic stewardship takes that assumed meaning of stewardship as just money and expands it to encompass everything. So as we live our lives for God, we continue to develop that idea, and our spiritual journey follows along that everything is God's, the world, and everything in it. And you may say to me, Pastor, that seems like a lot. And it is a lot. The Christianity is a lifestyle, not just a hobby. And you've heard me say that before. But I'll continue to say it. Christianity isn't something we just do on Sundays for an hour when we come to church. Christianity is how we live, how we function, how we speak, how we act in our everyday lives. Not just at church, not just with our church friends, but at work, at the grocery store, when we're super cranky behind somebody who's buying 100 things with 10 coupons and is writing a check. And you have your kids. Right. Christianity has to encompass that too. It's not a club that we visit once a week, pay our dues, and leave it at the door, right? Christianity is a whole life situation. And we don't get to choose the parts of our lives which we devote to God. When we are God people, Christ followers, Christians, it's all God's. Our Christianity and our faith encompasses all of who we are. Should encompass all of who we are. Which is why our prayer is, in God I trust. Is that how I'm going to function? So if everything is God's and God is the owner, we are called to manage well what God has given us. So for the next few weeks, we're going to talk about this idea of holistic stewardship, what stewardship really means in our day-to-day life. Today I'm going to talk about stewardship of the created order. Next week we'll do time and talents. The next week we'll do tithe. So just so you know what's coming, that's what we're going to be dealing with. Environmental stewardship, or stewardship of the created order, is the idea that we should care for, manage well, and nurture what God has created. This, for me, seems like the most overlooked piece of stewardship. When you go to churches and they do a stewardship series, you often hear the time and talents stewardship series. You often hear the tithe. Obviously, you hear the tithe a lot. But I don't think a lot of people go into this stewardship of the created order. But I feel like it's such an important piece, and we can't forget it. A few years ago, now this was before I had kids, I had the ability to do this, but I took a pastoral retreat, and some of you might remember that, and I went up to Michigan, and I took a couple days and went to this gorgeous retreat center on the lake. No technology. I drove my car there, but left it there, didn't use it while I was there. No TV, no radio, no phone, no, Candy Crush, none of that stuff. Just me in a cabin, and during the day I'd go out and be part of breathing My gosh, how much do we get to do that? Just breathe. And we live life and we're so busy and we're so hectic all the time, and we don't even think about settling down and going outside and just, right, taking a deep breath and being silent. And so it was just me and nature and God. Spending time in the middle of God's creation and looking at the lake and seeing the birds and seeing the trees and seeing all that God has created, it really got me to thinking, as a pastor, do we, as Christians, have a responsibility for all of this? And if so, what is that responsibility? So, I want to refresh you. About what God has created. You can just listen, or you can turn with me in Genesis 1. It's the first book of the Old Testament, the very beginning, after all those tables and whatnot. Genesis 1, starting with verse 1. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while the wind from God swept over the face of the waters. And then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from waters." And so God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome, sky. And there was evening and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let dry land appear." And it was so, and God called the dry land earth. And the waters were gathered together, and he called them sea. And God saw that it was good. And then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation and plants yielding seeds, and fruit trees of every kind that bear fruit and the seed on it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seeds of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with seeds in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let there be signs for seasons and for days and for years, and let them be lights in the dome of the sky, and give light to the earth." And it was so. And so God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the dome of the sky to give light to the earth, to rule over the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth in the dome of the sky." And so God created great sea monsters of every kind, creatures that move, with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters of the sea, and let the birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things and wild animals of the earth." And it was so. And God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. And then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and the birds of the air, and the cattle, and the wild animals of the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps." And so God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing on the earth." And God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree with seed and its fruit, and you shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. And God saw everything that God had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. And thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day God finished the work that he had done, and rested from the work of creating. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. What a beautiful story. What a beautiful remembrance of what it is that God has done and what it is that God has created. And God called it what? Good. The problem with this is that when it comes right down to it, humanity has not loved the created order very well. The knowledge of God, the Creator, and the recovery of respect for the whole of God's creation is a matter of urgency. It is getting more and more difficult to ignore the signs that the earth is suffering under gross mismanagement. We have not been good stewards of what God has created. Now, I'm not going to take the time to dive into the scientific discussion. I'm not going to move on to politics because it has nothing to do with that. This is about who we know, God, and what God has created. The planet we live on is irreplaceable. And we're completely dependent on it for food, for breath, for life. And yet we take so often for granted, or worse, we're just careless with it. And we hear about this a lot in the news, but today I want to speak to this issue from a faith perspective and with a biblical and theological framework. Today we want to ask this question: what is it that God expects of us relative to how we live on this planet? How can we be good stewards of the created order? They say that there's nothing new under the sun. Humanity in 2017 is really no different from humanity in the beginning. Adam and Eve, knowing what God wanted them to do, failed to do it. They chose to focus instead on themselves and what they wanted and not on God's will. And this is our human condition, isn't it? Adam and Eve took the earth for granted, and every generation since has done the same thing. We're interested in what's in it for me. What can I get out of it? What can it do for me? We're interested in convenience and comfort. And as a result, we've pillaged the earth and wounded our planet, and that's manifested in a million different ways because we treat God's creation carelessly. In Romans 8:19 through 21, it says, "The entire creation groans under the weight of human sin." And we read that verse so often in church, and we think about it in the terms of humanity. Humanity groans under the weight of our sin, because we know that our sin affects other people. But I think we also need to look at this scripture and say, is it just humanity that groans under the weight of our sin and our carelessness? Or is it all of creation? This is our human condition. We take the created order for granted. We fail to see the handiwork of God, to sit in nature and look at the beauty and the intricacy there. And instead we use it as a tool for our personal enjoyment and nothing more. Now, the good news in all of this is that God has sent us a Redeemer to save us from our sin and to give us rebirth and a new start. Once we become followers of Jesus, it is no longer just about us. Salvation brings with it a desire to follow God's purposes and follow God's plan and follow God's will. And within that is the call to be good stewards of all that God has entrusted to us. So does God care how we treat creation? Yes. God created it, and it was good. And of course God cares how we treat it, what we do with it. Why would God spend 7 days, and we don't know if these were exact 24-hour days or if they were lengthy or whatever, or if it was boom and it was done. We don't know. It doesn't matter. What matters is, would God spend that amount of time creating something that creating things that weren't important? God created this world and what's in it for us to use and cultivate and take care of and maintain and multiply and be blessed by, but not to abuse or to destroy or to misuse. What God has created good deserves our attention, and we've been neglecting it. What God sees as good, we need to see as valuable. When God looks over the earth, does God still see it as good? Do you think that God is happy with what the human race has done to the good creation? God established Adam and Eve as rulers over the earth. He gave them dominion. And through this act, God made them partners in his creation, placing the entire world into their care. It was in Eden that humanity first became stewards and acted as God's agents on the earth. And so God gave humankind dominion, but what does that mean? Well, one thing it does not mean is domination. The idea of mankind's dominion has been twisted to mean domination or mastery, and what it really means is management, responsibility for. We are to take care of the creation. The idea of dominion summarizes the notion that human beings exercise a unique place in God's created order. God didn't give it for the cows to have dominion. God didn't give it for the eagles to have dominion. Out of all the created order, God gave humanity this responsibility. So we are set apart, unique, and charged to be good stewards. So does God care how we treat the created world? Yes. Imagine, if you will, that Vera decided to go on a long trip and visit her kids. She has 3 out of 4 kids that live out of state. Maybe she decides to go on a lengthy trip and spend some time in Indiana and spend some time out west with the other 2 kids, and she's going to leave for 6 months. Have you been to Vera's condo or house, or have you ever been to her place? She keeps a nice house, right? So she's leaving for 6 months. She decides, well, she can't just leave it for 6 months. That's no good. Somebody has to take care of it. So Vera calls up Ashley, and she says, Ashley, will you take care of my house while I'm gone? Will you manage it? It's mine, it's still Vera's, right? But will you manage it for 6 months? So let's imagine that this happened. Vera would give Ashley her keys, leave her the password to the bank account so that Ashley could pay all the bills, sign a bunch of checks so that Ashley could take care of Vera's world. What would Vera expect from Ashley? She would certainly expect her to use the house, to eat the food in it so it didn't go to waste, to drive the car and change its oil and maintain it, to watch her TV or use her computer. Vera might even ask Ashley to check her email and pass along anything urgent. And if Ashley broke something by accident, Vera would expect it to be fixed. In the same way, we have been asked to be managers, to be stewards of God's house. God has left us in charge of it, to take care of it, to keep it up, to maintain it. Taken on a global scale, we have not been very good caretakers. It's more like we moved in and trashed God's house. We busted up holes in it, we depleted the bank account, we've driven our cars like maniacs, smashed the TV, used the computer to download viruses, all without regard to the true owner. We are given dominion, and that means we are caretakers. God has given us the rest of creation to care for, to use, not to use up, to manage well. We are in a coexistence with the rest of the created order. We aren't better than, we are part of. So what can we do? I think the first thing that we need to do before we even get to the practical side of it is to understand that we proclaim love for God not just by our words, but by our actions. This is God's world, and we are called to be good stewards of what God has created. We have to make that mental switch that we talked about last week. We are not the owners of the world. We cannot do with it whatever we please. We are to be good stewards. And after we get there mentally, there are some practical ways that we can care for God's creation. How? Not a rhetorical question. How can we care for God's creation?
Don't litter.
Don't litter. Absolutely. What else? Recycle. It's a lot of our resources that are just filling landfills that could be recycled. What else?
Use the natural resources you've given us,
Yes,
which we don't do.
which we don't do. You're right. Because it's easier to just buy something disposable or buy something easier. Absolutely. What else? You know that little triangle thing? The recycle, reduce, reuse, recycle thing? It's been around for a long time. What Casey's talking about is that reduce thing. That first one, reduce. And that's the first thing we need to do is reduce. We are immense consumers as human beings. We buy things we don't need. We look for items that are convenient, even if they have 700 layers of packaging. Convenience comes over care. And there are simple things that we can do to reduce and care for God's creation. Turn off your lights when you leave a room. Ever watch Mythbusters? Mythbusters say that the only reason to leave a light on when you're leaving the room is if it's only going to be 2 seconds that you're gone. 2 seconds. It saves energy if you are going to be gone longer than 2 seconds. That's a pretty short amount of time. So if you are leaving the room, even to go to the bathroom, turn off your lights. It's an easy thing to do. Take a 10-minute shower instead of a 20-minute shower. Reduce. I know you like warm showers. Get a warm, cozy blanket and sit under that for a while. There are some really easy things that we can do to reduce what we're using. Look for things with less packaging. You can get noodles in a package that's like a paper package. Or you can get noodles that have like a plastic bag inside of a plastic box and have all of that extra stuff. So look for little stuff. Okay, the next one is reuse. What does reuse mean? How can you reuse things?
Tupperware instead of plastic.
Tupperware instead of plastic? Something you can wash? Absolutely.
Cloth diapers.
What?
Cloth diapers.
Cloth diapers?
Good luck with that, Mike.
I mean, I won't be doing it.
Hey, he knows what he's talking about, even if he doesn't do it. That's good. Yes. Don't buy dust rags. How many of you have 100 mismatched socks in the laundry room? They fit on your hand and can dust. Okay? Reuse. Art keeps getting hit during this thing.
He keeps pointing to me.
Buy some of those reusable grocery bags, right? They're like 99 cents. Every time you go to the grocery store, they don't even ask, they used to ask paper or plastic, and actually they realized that paper was worse for the environment because of how it was made, even though it's recyclable. So they don't even ask that anymore, they just give you all these plastic bags. I have a million plastic bags, like stuffed all places in my house. Don't use those. I mean, like, how hard is it to buy one of those? I mean, it's 99 cents. If you need 99 cents to buy one of those reusable bags, I'll give it to you. And it's an easy way to reuse stuff. Okay, recycle. Listen, okay, here's the thing about all of this. It's a lot of work. It's inconvenient. But is any of Christianity convenient? This is another one of those things, and we don't think of it as being a good steward. We don't think of it as being faithful to God. And it takes a little bit more time. Niles doesn't have curbside recycling. That makes me crazy because it means I have to bag up all my recycling and bring it to Lordstown when I come to work. And it's a pain in the butt. But, different kind of butt. It's worth it. It's important because I have an entire garbage can, words are hard, I have an entire garbage can full of recycling probably twice a week. And if I was putting all of that in a landfill where it's not going to be able to be repurposed or whatever, or biodegrade into the environment, that's a bunch of waste. And you may be thinking, this is ridiculous, why are you talking about this from the pulpit? Because it is God's creation that we are dumping on. And that is important. And that is biblical. And yeah, it takes extra work to reduce, reuse, recycle, to think about how we function. It takes a lot of work to have an extra trash can and think about the fact that when you've got a can of Pringles, the lid can go into the recycling, even if the other part has to be thrown away, or whatever. It takes extra work, but come on, Christians. Most of our life takes a little bit of extra work. When somebody is mean to us, and we don't respond with, well, you're a jerk, and instead respond with the love of Christ, that takes extra work, doesn't it? Being faithful to God, being good stewards of God's creation, yeah, it takes extra work, but it's part of our call as the people of God. We can't do everything, and I know that, but we can do something. Here at the church, we have a recycle bin. It is literally right beside the trash can. And every single week, I dig plastic bottles out of the trash can. Why is that? They're literally right next to each other. It would not take you more time to put it in the recycle bin. At home, you can do the same thing. We have 2 trash cans side by side. It takes the same amount of time. Once you get that extra trash can, it takes the same amount of time to throw it in recycling instead of the trash. And it's something that we need to do.
Esther, I have a recycle bin that my garbage company gave us.
Oh yeah?
Every 2 weeks they pick it up.
There you go. If you live in Lordstown, is it curbside?
Yes. It's for
Curbside
public
recycling.
services, but they don't do it miles from us.
I know, they don't do it in Niles. It's terrible.
But they pass
there you
it
go.
out Lordstown.
Okay, Lordstown, you've got it easier than the rest of us. Curbside recycling.
Yeah, we have it too.
You have it too? New Falls?
Okay.
All right. A lot of you people are from New Falls and Lordstown. Thank you, Sandy. Okay. Now, you may still not be convinced, and you may be thinking, my gosh, this pastor is ridiculous, and why are we talking about recycling during a sermon? It's important. It's creating for God. It's caring for God's creation. And maybe it sounds too different from what we normally talk about in church, but consider What would you say is like the most famous verse in the Bible? John 3:16. For God so loved humanity. Is that what it says? The world. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. Now you may be thinking, okay, maybe it was translated that way, and it really means humanity. You want to look into the Greek, the word is cosmos. You know what that word means? Not humanity. For God so loved the cosmos that he sent his son. Talking about being good stewards of God's created order is biblical and godly. And if you're still not convinced, consider Colossians 1:15 through 21. Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. He existed before God made anything and is supreme over all creation. Not humanity, creation. Christ is the one through whom God created everything in heaven and on earth. He made the things we can see and the things we can't see. Everything has been created through him and for him. And Psalm 21, which we already read, says the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. While God may have given us dominion, the planet ultimately still belongs to God. It was created for him. And so we have to take care of this wonderful creation. Theologian Howard Snyder said this: "Today we look back at the Protestants of the 16th and 17th centuries and ask, why did they not have a sense of the Christian global missionary mandate? Or we look back at the Christian slaveholders in the 18th and 19th century and ask, how could they not see that slavery was incompatible with the gospel? Our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, I think, will look back at our generation and say, how could they not see that it is the Christian responsibility to care for the earth? Why did they wait so long? What were they thinking when they failed to defend the forests and the seas and protect Earth's endangered species? Did they not understand what they were doing? We today, Snyder says, are the generation that must rediscover and proclaim creation as part of the gospel, part of the mission of God. Christians, we ought to be the biggest environmentalists because we know who created it and we know what it's worth. If we truly believe that God is the creator and that this is God's world, we need to be more careful with how we function in it and with it. To change the world, we need to start somewhere. To develop good habits, to find practical ways to conserve, start with small steps. Stewardship is more than just about the money that we give. It is about our way of life and how we care for the blessings that God has given us. It is another way, this stewardship of the created order, it is another way that we can show God that we love him and get involved in what God has created good. And so we make this declaration and we proclaim that we are stewards of the created order and that we are called to care for what God has created good. Will you stand with me?